On the evening of the 4th of April 1900, the Prince of Wales and his wife, Alexandra of Denmark, were boarding a train in Brussels when a 15-year-old boy named Jean-Baptiste Sipido fired off 2 shots from a pistol into their coach. Neither bullet hit the target, and the prince would go on to become King Edward VII of the United Kingdom and Emperor of India 9 months later. Oddly, though, the attempted assassination brought husband and wife closer together right before they became king and queen. Theirs was not an easy relationship. They had married all the way back in 1863, following which Edward had continued to act as though he was basically not a married man at all. He had several long-term mistresses and dozens of other lovers. The prince had most likely sired illegitimate children as well as his 3 sons and 3 daughters with Alexandra. In 1870, he had even ended up being called to testify in court during the divorce proceedings surrounding one of his lovers, Harriet Mordaunt, from her husband, Sir Charles Mordaunt. The case was a scandal at the time, given how unprecedented it was to call an heir to the throne to testify in court. Alexandra was humiliated, and Edward's mother, Queen Victoria, was livid, albeit she blamed Edward's friends, the Marlborough House set as they were known, for leading her son astray in his behaviour. Hence, an assassination attempt in 1900 by a teenage anarchist, one who incidentally was acquitted in court afterwards on account of his young age, was just the latest episode in a genuinely eventful marriage between Edward and Alexandra. Thrones, assassination attempts, repeated affairs, illegitimate children, and court cases. This is the story of King Edward VII of the United Kingdom and Queen Alexandra of Denmark, Britain's most peculiar royal couple. The man known to history as King Edward VII of the United Kingdom was born in Buckingham Palace in London on the 9th of November 1841. As the firstborn son of Queen Victoria of the United Kingdom, he was heir to the British throne. His mother, the 22-year-old Queen Victoria, had been on the British throne since 1837, following the death of her uncle, King William IV. At the time of her birth in 1819, near the end of the reign of her grandfather, George III, Princess Victoria had been 5th in the line of succession, but the death of her father, Edward, Duke of Kent and Strathearn, as well as her 3 childless uncles, placed her on the throne at the age of 18. She would remain as queen for more than 60 years, during which her heir became increasingly impatient about his chance to become king. The young prince's father and namesake was Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, a German prince and Victoria's cousin. The couple were engaged in 1837, but did not marry until the 10th of February 1840, with Albert taking the title of Prince Consort. Albert would become a close political advisor and loving husband, and the couple would have 9 children between 1840 and 1857. The eldest, Princess Victoria, was born in November 1840, less than a year before the birth of Albert Edward, who was named after his father and maternal grandfather. Edward's birth was enthusiastically welcomed all over the country, and on the 25th of January 1842, the boy was baptized by the Archbishop of Canterbury at St. George's Chapel in Windsor Castle and given the name Prince Albert Edward. As the eldest son of the British monarch, he held the titles of Duke of Cornwall and Duke of Rothesay from birth and was given the title of Prince of Wales a month later on the 8th of December. Albert Edward, known as Bertie to the family, grew up during a time when the British Empire was reaching its greatest heights. The United Kingdom was the first country to experience the Industrial Revolution, as the invention of new manufacturing processes and the specialization of labor enabled the economy to grow at a rapid rate. Following the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, Britain had defeated France in the struggle to become the dominant global superpower, controlling the trade routes through the Royal Navy. In addition to the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, the British Empire's territories included Canada, the Indian subcontinent, parts of southern Africa, Australia, and New Zealand, while British economic power meant that its influence stretched far beyond its formal imperial boundaries. The United Kingdom was one of few countries to have a constitutional monarchy where political power was shared between the monarch and Parliament, consisting of the House of Lords representing the aristocracy and the church, and the House of Commons representing the country's business and mercantile interests. Since the Civil War in the 17th century and the Glorious Revolution of 1689, the powers of the monarch had gradually diminished over the countries, and the executive power of the sovereign was devolved to the Prime Minister and his cabinet, which introduced government legislation and steered it through Parliament. While parliamentary legislation still had to receive royal assent, this was increasingly a formality, and the monarch was reduced to serving as a source of advice to the government. As a future king, the young Bertie followed a program of education designed to teach him the duties of being a constitutional monarch, which was devised by his father in 1847. Although the child proved to be charming and likable, he was inattentive and struggled in his studies, especially when compared to his older sister Victoria, whose abilities surpassed those of her age. The Prince of Wales' shortcomings simply prompted his parents to apply stricter disciplinary measures, and in April 1849, Bertie's education was entrusted to Henry Birch of Eton College, who described the young prince as extremely disobedient, impertinent to his masters, and unwilling to submit to discipline. With a short attention span and a tendency to lose his temper easily, especially when he was teased. Despite this, he was subject to frequent teasing and mockery from his tutor in the best traditions of the British public school. Nevertheless, Bertie had grown fond of Birch and was sad to see him quit his post of tutor in 1852 when he was ordained as a priest, and the departing tutor was also sorry to leave his young charge. The prince was much less fond of his replacement, a lawyer and Cambridge fellow called Frederick Weymouth Gibbs, who made his frustrations clear in his reports to the Queen and Prince Consort. The course of instruction was intense, with lessons beginning at 8 in the morning and ending at 7 in the evening. Some of Bertie's tutors, including his German tutor and Albert's librarian, Dr. Becker, and his religious instructor, the Reverend Gerald Wellesley, younger brother to the late Duke of Wellington, believed that the prince's studies were too exacting and proposed a lightening of the load. But this suggestion was rejected by Victoria and Albert, who believed that the only remedy to Bertie's behaviour was physical discipline. The young prince's tendency for violent outbursts led to fears that he had inherited the condition of his great-grandfather, George III, who had experienced multiple bouts of insanity during his life. Although Victoria had hoped to bring up her son in the image of his father, Prince Albert's strict approach to parenting and his efforts to keep Bertie isolated from boys of his age caused the latter to be afraid of him. Bertie was consciously aware that he did not live up to the expectations of his father, although he enjoyed hunting, watching operatic and theatrical performances, and appearing at public events such as military reviews and ceremonies alongside the Queen in his capacity as Prince of Wales. Keen to escape the walls of Buckingham Palace, He enjoyed his first foreign trip to visit his great-uncle King Leopold in Belgium, but he was particularly charmed by the attractions of Paris, when, at the age of 13, he accompanied his parents on a state visit to Emperor Napoleon III in August 1855. Bertie's isolation further increased when he was separated from his younger brother Alfred, with whom he had shared many childhood lessons, and in 1858 he bid farewell to his dear sister, Princess Victoria, who had married Crown Prince Frederick William of Prussia and was joining him in Potsdam. In the same year, Queen Victoria recognized that Gibbs' approach was not working, and Bertie was given more independence and a new allowance of £500 a year, most of which he spent on clothes, further exasperating his parents. Alongside his newfound independence, the prince was granted his wish to join the army, and was appointed to the rank of lieutenant colonel, but was disappointed that he had not been allowed to take the usual examinations, as Victoria and Albert feared the embarrassment of him not passing. Moreover, his new governor, Colonel Robert Bruce, had instructions to maintain a close watch over him, a sign that his parents still did not trust the 17-year-old prince to look after his own affairs properly. Even when Bertie was sent to Christ Church College, Oxford in October 1858, a month shy of his 18th birthday, Prince Albert ensured that Bruce, now promoted to Major General, would continue to supervise his movements. For all his shortcomings, Bertie had performed admirably in his exams in Oxford, winning rare praise from his parents. Victoria and Albert's faith in their son's abilities was further boosted by the prince's tour of Canada in July 1860, being the first heir to the British throne to make a transatlantic journey. He was enthusiastically welcomed everywhere he went, landing in Newfoundland and proceeding up the St. Lawrence River to Hamilton via Montreal, Ottawa and Toronto. On the 20th of September, he crossed the border into the United States for a month-long tour where he proved equally popular, drawing a crowd of 300,000 people in New York. In Washington, he met President James Buchanan and was taken to see George Washington's house and grave at Mount Vernon, and had the opportunity to attend a parade at West Point alongside General Winfield Scott. The tour was a resounding success, and Bertie's conduct was met with widespread approval from both his parents, who no longer considered him a lost cause. The prince had hoped that he would be allowed to join the army following his return from his transatlantic tour, but was instead transferred to Trinity College, Cambridge, to continue his studies. He particularly enjoyed lectures from Charles Kingsley, the new Regius Professor of Modern History, with whom he had interesting discussions on contemporary politics. In the summer of 1861, the Prince of Wales was finally given the opportunity to fulfill his ambitions of receiving military instruction. But his excitement was tempered by the exacting 10-week training regime he had to undertake with the Grenadier Guards at the Curragh military camp near Dublin, during which he was expected to carry out the duties of a lowly ensign at the beginning and to have the ability to command a battalion by the end. Such a demanding course of instruction proved too much for Bertie, and when his parents visited Curragh on the 23rd of August in the company of the Duke of Cambridge, the Queen's cousin and commander-in-chief, all three came to the conclusion that the prince was not fit to be a soldier. Life in the military camp did have its consolations when the prince's friends smuggled the young actress Nellie Clifton into his room. The prince enjoyed her company and had seemingly fallen in love with her, continuing to see her as often as he could after his return to England, which undermined his parents' efforts to find him a suitable wife. Victoria and Albert cast their eyes over the royal houses of Europe for a princess who would one day become Queen of the United Kingdom, and after an exhaustive search, they decided on the 17-year-old Princess Alexandra of Denmark, the daughter of Prince Christian, heir to the Danish throne. The two met in September 1861 in Speyer Cathedral in Germany under the auspices of Bertie's sister and brother-in-law, Crown Princess Victoria and Crown Prince Frederick William. Although the prince found the Danish princess charming, he appeared unenthusiastic about the prospect of marriage, and it was only when Prince Albert learned of his son's affair with Nellie Clifton that the severity of the situation became clear. After informing the Queen, the Prince Consort wrote his son a lengthy rebuke, speculating about the damaging public scandal that would arise should the young girl give birth to the prince's child, prompting Bertie to acknowledge his guilt and regret over the affair and to commit to marrying Princess Alexandra as soon as possible. Albert's health had been gradually declining, and when he visited Bertie in Cambridge at the end of November, the stress of the situation may have worsened the Prince Consort's illness. Late on the 14th of December, Prince Albert died of an illness diagnosed by contemporaries as typhoid fever, leaving the Queen distraught and in mourning for her remaining 40 years. Despite the Prince of Wales' best efforts to console his mother, Queen Victoria was convinced that her eldest son's scandalous behaviour had been the cause of her beloved Albert's death, and relations between mother and son remained forever strained as a result. The late Prince Albert had envisaged a tour of the Middle East as the final stage of his son's programme of education, and Bertie embarked on the trip in January 1862, arriving at Alexandria in Egypt on the 1st of March, going up and down the Nile before proceeding on to the Holy Land and arriving at Damascus at the end of April. Like his previous tours abroad, the prince did not seem particularly interested in sightseeing or learning about the millennia of history witnessed by the stones of the temples and churches he visited, but was more comfortable exchanging pleasantries with his hosts and going on hunting trips. By late May, he was in Constantinople, where he met the Ottoman Sultan, making his way home via Greece and France. On the whole, the tour proved another success and helped to improve the prince's relationship with his mother, but it was, however, marred by the death of General Bruce, who had contracted a fever when abroad and died soon after his return to England. Both the Queen and the Prince of Wales were keen on moving forward with the wedding with Princess Alexandra, and accordingly the engagement was announced in September 1862, and the couple were married on the 10th of March 1863 at St. George's Chapel in Windsor. Although Queen Victoria was very fond of her daughter-in-law, the occasion proved bittersweet, coming so soon after Albert's death, and when she sat for a photograph with the newlywed couple, her eyes were instead fixed upon a bust of her late husband. Bertie and Alex, as Princess Alexandra was nicknamed in the British royal family, spent their time between Marlborough House in London on Pall Mall, round the corner from St James's Palace, and the country estate of Sandringham House in Norfolk, which the prince had bought in 1862. The princess was charmed by the estate, that was set in flat terrain which reminded her of her Danish homeland, but other visitors were known to complain about the barren landscape and lack of activities in the area. Nevertheless, the prince and princess made it a tradition to stay at Sandringham for their birthdays on the 9th of November and 1st of December respectively, as well as for the Christmas holidays. Even as he settled into married life with Princess Alexandra, the Queen could not help but continue to express her anxieties about her son and the company he kept, believing that it was harmful to her beloved daughter-in-law. She was particularly concerned about Bertie's association with the beautiful and vivacious Duchess of Manchester, who had taken on a string of lovers, including Bertie's close friend Lord Hartington, later Duke of Devonshire, whom she eventually married upon the death of her husband. The Queen was also concerned about her son's influence in London society, where he was the patron of the Garrick Club, frequented by actors and actresses. Victoria believed that by keeping such company, the Prince of Wales risked the dignity of the crown and associated her son's behaviour with what she saw as a decline in the moral values of the British aristocracy. The Queen's negative opinion of her son's character prompted her to exclude him from any position of power or authority. She restricted his access to important state papers and did not allow him to act as her representative in public. The Queen was justified in her worries over her son's indiscretion on political matters, which revealed itself in 1864 when German armies, led by Prussia and Austria, invaded Denmark to exercise a dynastic claim to the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein. While the Prince of Wales was naturally and openly sympathetic towards his father-in-law, now King Christian IX of Denmark, Queen Victoria quietly favoured the German claim and criticised her son for his pro-Danish views, even though they were shared by the public. Not for the first time in British history, the heir to the throne was undermining official government policy, going as far as discussing his objections with the leaders of the liberal opposition. When the Italian revolutionary General Giuseppe Garibaldi visited the United Kingdom, hoping to rally English support for the Danish cause, he received an enthusiastic reception at his public appearances. Garibaldi was staying at Stafford House, the home of the prince's close friend, the Duke of Sutherland, and the prince made sure to call on his friend while the Italian hero was present. The meeting prompted a severe rebuke from the Queen, who was appalled at the idea that the heir to a crown could so brazenly meet an avowed revolutionary. But the prince refused to apologize and considered the meeting a success. Not only had Victoria been running out of patience with her son, but she was also in the process of doing so with her daughter-in-law. In December 1863, Alex had given birth to a son named Albert Victor by the Queen, despite the objections of the child's parents. The Queen believed that the princess was being worn out by the active lifestyle the couple continued to lead after the birth of their son, and she was unable to stop the couple from visiting the princess's Danish relatives in September 1864, despite the diplomatic difficulties with the German states, whose armies had seized control of Schleswig and Holstein. When Alex gave birth to her second child, Prince George, on the 3rd of June 1865, Victoria repeated her complaints, but within a year the princess was pregnant once again, preventing her from going to Russia to attend the wedding of her sister Dagmar to Grand Duke Alexander, the son and heir of Tsar Alexander II. The Prince of Wales went without her and thoroughly enjoyed his time in St. Petersburg and Moscow, temporarily improving relations between Britain and Russia, whose imperial ambitions were colliding in Central Asia. Upon his return from Russia, the prince discovered that his wife was ill, suffering pains in her limbs which were exacerbated by the birth of Princess Louise on the 20th of February 1867. Bertie appears to have made light of his wife's serious health condition, continuing to go out most evenings and feeling bored when obliged to spend time at her bedside. Alex's health gradually improved in the coming months, but she was still confined to a wheelchair by July, and she would walk with a limp for the rest of her life. Bertie's neglect of his wife proved even more hurtful following rumours that the prince had taken a liking to certain young ladies during his time in Russia and often found himself in female company during a visit to France to attend the opening of the Paris exhibition in April 1867. When Alex was well enough to travel to Wiesbaden in Germany to take the waters, she caused a diplomatic incident by refusing to meet with King Wilhelm of Prussia, whom she blamed for the devastation of her homeland. It was up to Bertie to apologise for his wife and to meet the King and Queen of Prussia alone. But when this did not satisfy the parties involved, the prince forced a meeting with the king upon his reluctant wife, which went far more cordially than anyone had the right to expect. Queen Victoria was not amused during the whole scandal and became convinced that both her son and daughter-in-law were unfit to occupy the royal offices that they would one day inherit. By his 20s, the Prince of Wales had developed a reputation as a prince of pleasure. He hated being idle and attended horse races and hunts throughout the country, frequented banquets and balls in London, visited musical and theatrical establishments, and was once seen dancing the can-can with the Duchess of Manchester in a nightclub. Every year, the prince would make several visits abroad, including brief visits to Paris without his wife. Even at home in Marlborough House or Sandringham, the prince enjoyed entertaining male friends, playing cards, billiards, or making use of the bowling alleys that had been specially installed in both his houses, while the women were invited to dance with the prince. These entertainments, the costs of refurbishing and expanding the house at Sandringham, combined with his fondness for gambling modest sums, put pressure on the prince's finances. In spite of this, in the autumn of 1868, soon after Alex gave birth to her daughter Victoria, the prince and princess embarked on an expensive 7-month-long holiday through Germany and Austria to Egypt, Turkey, Crimea, and back via Greece, Italy, and France. For most of his life, the Prince of Wales had been extremely popular among the British public, but a scandal which broke in the spring of 1869 considerably undermined his popularity. The case involved the 21-year-old Lady Harriet Mordaunt, the wife of Liberal MP Sir Charles Mordaunt, who had been an occasional guest at the prince's parties. After the birth of her first child, Lady Harriet began to act eccentrically, when it was feared that her daughter might be blind, which she attributed to venereal disease. She admitted to her husband that she had committed adultery on several occasions, including with the Prince of Wales, a claim that was supported by Sir Charles's discovery of letters from the prince to his wife in a drawer, prompting him to ask for a divorce. The prince pleaded innocence and was supported by his family, including the Queen, and confidently denied that he had acted improperly with Lady Harriet when he was obliged to give evidence in court on the 23rd of February 1870. Although the case was dismissed on the grounds that Lady Harriet was declared insane and confined to a lunatic asylum, the British public continued to believe that the prince had been unfaithful, causing great damage to the reputation of the monarchy and leading to calls for a republic. There was considerable public sympathy for Princess Alexandra, who had given birth to her 5th child, Princess Maud, in November 1869. Supporters of the monarchy agreed that the Prince of Wales may have avoided such a delinquent lifestyle if he had been given greater responsibilities by his mother, and even in his late 20s, his royal duties remained relatively minor. The prince offered to carry out diplomatic duties, but both the Queen and her government considered this to be improper in light of his tendency to be indiscreet. When France and Prussia went to war in July 1870, his sympathies had lain towards France, but he offered to mediate between Paris and Berlin. These offers were never taken seriously, and the decisive Prussian victory at the Battle of Sedan on the 1st and 2nd of September 1870, during which the Emperor Napoleon III fell into Prussian captivity, ensured that the conflict would end in Prussia's favour, the final stepping stone to the unification of the Empire of Germany. The royal family's fortunes were only revived by the Prince of Wales suffering a near-death experience in late 1871 after catching typhoid fever, the same disease which was said to have claimed the life of his father. By early December, it was feared he would not survive, and the Queen and members of the royal family were summoned to his bedside. But on the 15th of December, the prince began a slow recovery, with his wife constantly at his side. The Prime Minister, William Gladstone, arranged a ceremony of public thanksgiving for the Prince's recovery at St Paul's Cathedral to take place on the 27th of February 1872, which resulted in a public outpouring of affection for the Queen and the Prince of Wales as they rode in an open carriage. After the Prince had made his full recovery, the government decided that it was time for him to play a more active public role. Although the Prince would have preferred a career in the army, the Queen believed that her son was not capable of exercising the order and discipline required for a serving army officer, while proposals by ministers to give the Prince a position in the government of India or Ireland were also vetoed. Meanwhile, the Prince once again demonstrated his unsuitability for any diplomatic role upon a visit to France in the summer of 1872, during which he met Adolphe Thiers, the president of the newly established French Third Republic. The meeting was a further demonstration to the Germans of the Prince's pro-French sympathies, but the Prince also attracted criticism from French Republicans by meeting with former aristocrats and supporters of the deposed Napoleon III, who would die in English exile on the 9th of January, 1873. Frustrated by his lack of responsibilities, the Prince planned a tour of India for 1875 without informing neither the government, his mother, the Queen, nor his wife. While Victoria reluctantly gave her consent, the proposed costs of the trip were expected to be borne by the government and, by extension, the British public, leading to a series of public demonstrations against the Prince of Wales, whose reputation had not recovered fully from the Mordaunt affair. Meanwhile, Alex protested that she was to be left behind in England, refusing to accept Bertie's explanations that her presence would have complicated diplomatic protocol with the Indian princes. The Prince left England on the 26th of September and arrived at Bombay on the 8th of November, the eve of his 34th birthday. Despite fears that the Prince might receive a cold welcome and even be a target for assassination, the Times newspaper reported a few days later that from the moment the Prince set foot on the shores of India, there has been one continuous demonstration surpassing all that could be expected or imagined. Over the next 5 months, the Prince travelled all over the Indian subcontinent, including Goa, the island of Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, Madras, now Chennai, and Calcutta before the end of the year, and moving north in the new year to Delhi, Lahore, Agra, Jaipur, and going as far as Nepal. During the course of his travels, he reviewed troops of the colonial army, visited economic enterprises producing and processing the goods which fueled the wealth of the British Empire, and attended numerous banquets and other celebrations in his honour. As always, his charming manner worked its magic with Indians of all social classes, although his tendency to dance with the most attractive women, rather than those of the highest rank, caused some offence to a few of his Indian hosts. When the Prince left Bombay on the 13th of March, he took with him expensive gifts from his hosts, as well as a large collection of hunting trophies he had bagged during the trip, including several leopards, tigers, elephants, antelopes, ostriches, a Himalayan bear, and a cheetah. The tour was seen as a universal success which strengthened the British monarchy in India, and upon his return the Prince told the Queen that Indian affection for the British would be further bolstered if they were not treated so dismissively by British officials. And following this report, the Queen issued instructions to improve the conduct of officials in India. While the Prince had been on his way back to England, Parliament bestowed the title of Empress of India upon the Queen, which she gratefully accepted. But the Prince of Wales was disappointed not to be consulted on the issue, which saw his mother elevated to a rank much higher than his own. Throughout his life, the Prince had enjoyed the company of other ladies, and Princess Alexandra learned to overlook these dalliances in the knowledge that she never lost her husband's affection. In May 1877, a year after his return from India, the prince met the 24-year-old beauty Lillie Langtry for the first time, and by the end of the year the pair began a lengthy affair, helped along by the prince inviting her to the country houses where he was due to stay for the weekend. The romantic liaison lasted until 1880, as Langtry started taking other lovers, but the prince remained fond of her, and it was thanks to his influence that she launched into a successful career as a theatrical actress in 1881. By this point, the prince had transferred his attention to Lady Daisy Brooke, later the Countess of Warwick, engaging in an affair lasting well into the 1890s. The liaison ended when the prince grew bored of the lectures of a woman who had become an ardent socialist and attempted to persuade him to do more to improve the condition of the working classes. After the success of the India tour, the prince was even more frustrated at his lack of responsibilities in England. He made brief speeches in the House of Lords in his capacity as Duke of Cornwall, including one impassioned speech in favour of housing reform after an incognito visit to the slums of East London revealed the appalling poverty that affected many Londoners. In May 1880, he finally had his wish of a military appointment granted when he was made Colonel-in-Chief of the Household Cavalry, but the prince's desire to be sent out to Egypt in 1882 to join the forces quelling a nationalist revolt was opposed by the Queen and her ministers, who did not consider it wise to expose him to such dangers. As a result, the prince was reduced to hosting dinners honouring senior military officers who had been on campaign. Meanwhile, he was still denied access to important political and diplomatic documents. Though Benjamin Disraeli, the Queen's favourite Prime Minister, was known to pass on some information without telling the monarch. It was not until 1892, when the Prince of Wales was 51, that he was given access to state documents. Although he was not trusted with political matters, the Prince of Wales did prove an effective organiser of ceremonial events, such as Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee in 1887, for which he was in charge of the diplomatic protocol regulating the behaviour of foreign guests. He was also placed in charge of the arrangements for the Colonies and India exhibition the same year. Several years earlier, in 1883, he helped to found the Royal College of Music and served as chairman of the Executive Council, and his patronage helped to develop the institution as the premier venue for the training of professional musicians. As the Queen approached her final years in the 1890s, the Prince was given more opportunities to deputise for her, though this was largely as a consequence of the death or retirement of individuals who had previously performed these duties. In 1891, the Prince found himself embroiled in yet another public scandal, which again undermined his popularity among the wider public. In September 1890, he was a guest at Tranby Court, the Yorkshire home of shipping magnate Arthur Wilson. While the Prince and his friends were playing the card game baccarat, two of the guests suspected that Sir William Gordon Cumming, an officer in the Scots Guards and a friend of the Prince, had been cheating by surreptitiously adding to his stake. When the party returned to the card table the following day, Gordon Cumming's behaviour continued to be suspicious, and the Prince and his advisors were also persuaded that cheating had taken place. Those present pressured Gordon Cumming into signing a document in which he agreed that he would no longer play cards again, and the guests would stay quiet about the whole affair. The secret nevertheless leaked, and Gordon Cumming brought a lawsuit against his accusers, including the Prince, whose efforts to have the case heard in a military rather than a public civil court were in vain. The Solicitor General, Sir Edward Clarke, representing Gordon Cumming, managed to highlight inconsistencies in the accuser's statements, winning considerable public sympathy in the process. But the jury eventually decided that Gordon Cumming had indeed cheated. Although cleared once again, the affair dented the prince's popularity in the short term, confirming his reputation as a wastrel and gambler. Throughout his life, the Prince of Wales had associated himself with friends and acquaintances whom the Queen and other leading aristocrats had disapproved of. While many of these were indeed individuals of ill repute, the prince's friendships with prominent Jewish individuals and families was also controversial during a time of heightened anti-Semitism. The British aristocracy owed its wealth to land and was dismissive of those who came into money through business and finance. But the Prince of Wales was fascinated by economics and the capitalist system. He was a frequent guest of the Sassoons, a rich merchant family with extensive commercial operations in India, and was as friendly with the famous Rothschild banking family, having known Nathaniel Mayer Rothschild at Cambridge and been treated to entertainment at their vast estates throughout the country. The prince's limited income and his extravagant lifestyle led him to borrow money not only from the Rothschilds, but from other prominent Jewish financiers, including Sir Ernest Cassel, a German-born banker who became one of the wealthiest men in the country and was a financial backer of the Aswan Dam in Egypt, completed in 1902. In 1892, the Prince and Princess of Wales suffered a great tragedy with the death of their eldest son, Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence and Avondale, known to his parents as Prince Eddie. Like his father, Eddie was a poor student who was nevertheless blessed with charm and kindness. He spent his childhood and education alongside his younger brother George, and when they were 13 and 12 respectively, they were sent for naval training as cadets on the ship Britannia, where George performed much better. The Prince of Wales was experiencing the same headaches over what to do with an eldest son who failed to live up to expectations as his father, Prince Albert, had over his own upbringing. In his mid-20s, the handsome Prince Eddie began attracting the attentions of women, and in 1890 he fell in love with Princess Hélène of Orléans, who was not only a Roman Catholic, but the daughter of the pretender to the French throne. Such a match would, therefore, cause both religious and diplomatic issues, and despite both the Queen and Prince of Wales being in favour of the match, provided that the prospective bride convert to the Church of England, the proposal was rejected by her father, and the prospect of her conversion was also rejected by the Pope. With the French princess out of the picture, Princess Mary of Teck emerged as an alternative candidate, and the wedding was fixed for February 1892. It would never take place, as Prince Eddie fell seriously ill from pneumonia in December 1891 and died at Sandringham on the 14th of January 1892, days after his 28th birthday. His younger brother George would later marry the bereaved fiancée. Although devastated by the loss of his eldest son, the Prince of Wales could be consoled by the fact that it was now his far more able brother George who would become the heir to the throne. This prospect came closer with every passing year as Queen Victoria's health gradually declined. In 1897, she celebrated her Diamond Jubilee and remained in fine spirits for her 80th birthday a couple of years later, but eventually breathed her last on the 22nd of January 1901 after almost 64 years on the throne. Prince Albert Edward, after a 59-year wait, was finally king. The death of such a long-reigning monarch and the accession of a king whose personal life had caused public scandal on more than one occasion naturally called into question the stability of the British monarchy. In spite of these fears, the new king's popularity was little in doubt. Contrary to his mother's wishes for him to reign as King Albert Edward, he instead chose the designation Edward VII, arguing that it was a finer tribute for his father to be the only sovereign or consort named Albert. Despite his earlier objections to the circumstances in which his mother received her imperial title, the new king was happy to assume the title of Emperor of India, as if in protest against his late mother's inclinations to deny him powers and responsibilities. As soon as he moved into Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle, he ordered the reorganization and redecoration of her favourite rooms and the clearing of others which had not been touched since Prince Albert's death. Although King Edward continued to enjoy the same pastimes as he did as Prince of Wales, he enthusiastically carried out his new duties and responsibilities as a constitutional monarch, taking a great interest in the state papers to which he finally had full access. This early enthusiasm did not last long, and he soon discovered that he could not personally attend to every single small detail and reply to each of his letters, and soon relied on secretaries to carry out the work on his instructions. He was far more comfortable fulfilling his public engagements, travelling around the country laying foundation stones, visiting schools and hospitals, opening exhibitions at museums and galleries. During these occasions, as well as when carrying out more important political duties such as the state opening of Parliament and meetings of the Privy Council, the king proved an effective and eloquent speaker who did not need to refer to any notes. The king also took an interest in matters of defence policy, asking to be consulted about the promotion of senior officers while being a vital supporter of First Sea Lord Jackie Fisher's reforms to the Navy in the lead-up to the First World War. He was also keenly interested in healthcare and medicine, and proved a generous patron to hospitals, establishing King Edward's Hospital Fund for London in 1907, which continues to support hospitals in London to the present day. As it had been during his tenure as Prince of Wales, the king was particularly interested in matters of diplomacy and often received foreign representatives alone to communicate the position of his ministers, or carried out instructions from the government when he travelled abroad to meet his royal cousins sitting on a variety of European thrones. The king was irritated that his suggestions for diplomatic appointments were often ignored by the government, and tried to assert his constitutional right to be consulted on such matters. With few political friends, the king was often defeated in political fights against the government, prevailing only on minor issues. The king had a strained relationship with Conservative Prime Minister Arthur Balfour, who led the government between 1902 and 1905. The Liberal leader, Sir Henry Campbell Bannerman, who won the election in 1905, would enjoy better social relations with the king, but the political winds were blowing against the king in favour of parliamentary democracy. In spite of his warm friendship with the king, the Liberal government under Campbell Bannerman and later Herbert Asquith sought to weaken the constitutional role of the king and the House of Lords. After the end of the Second Boer War in 1902, which saw British imperial forces take control of South Africa at the cost of high casualties, Balfour proposed a royal commission to inquire into the conduct of war. The king was vehemently opposed, recognising the damage a public inquiry would do to the reputation of the British Army and Empire, but the Prime Minister insisted that the commission must go ahead. In another instance, the king was opposed to the appointment of native Indians to the Viceroy's Executive Council when the Indian lawyer and Advocate General of Bengal, Sachendra Prasanna Sinha, was invited to join the body in 1909. The king believed that the appointment would threaten British rule in India and strengthen calls for more Indians to join the body, making the observation that the appointment of a Hindu to the council may prompt Indian Muslims to demand one of their own on the body. One of the most bitter fights between the king and Balfour was over the proposed award of the Order of the Garter, the most senior British order of knighthood, to the Shah of Persia. The Balfour government persuaded the Shah to make a visit to Britain by promising him the Garter, but the king objected to the award on the basis that it was a Christian order, even though Muslim rulers such as the Shah's father and the Ottoman Sultan had both been previously admitted to the order by Queen Victoria. When the Foreign Secretary, Lord Lansdowne, claimed to have the King's approval for a variation of the order to be created for non-Christians and sent him a proposed design, the King exploded in fury, displaying a violent burst of temper which he had been prone to since his childhood. The incident would have forced the Foreign Secretary to resign if Balfour hadn't backed Lansdowne and threatened to make it a resignation issue for the whole government. Faced with cabinet unity and accepting his constitutional limits, the king gave way and reluctantly bestowed the honour upon the Shah on the condition that this would be the last time the Garter was awarded to a non-Christian, though 5 years later he would agree to confer it upon the Emperor of Japan. In spite of his increased duties and responsibilities as king, Edward VII continued to enjoy himself with amusements as he had done throughout his life. His annual routine was regulated not only by ceremonial events such as the state opening of Parliament at the beginning of the year, but also the horse racing at Ascot in June alongside other race meetings, and the Cowes Regatta off the Isle of Wight in August. He enjoyed being in the country during the summer for the hunting season, going up to Balmoral in October before spending his birthday and Christmas in Sandringham. Guests at Sandringham would often remark of his extraordinary appetite, beginning with platefuls of bacon, eggs, chicken and haddock for breakfast, followed by a heavy lunch at 2:30 in the afternoon, a selection of cakes and snacks for tea, and dinner at 8:30 in the evening, typically a 12-course meal during which the king would consume dozens of oysters and enjoy such rich dishes as pheasant stuffed with truffles, frog's legs, and other dishes inspired by the French culinary tradition that he was so fond of. King Edward continued to enjoy his holidays abroad, spending several months each year in his beloved France. During these trips, he would travel incognito as the Duke of Lancaster or Earl of Chester, but this did not prevent him from being followed by French police detectives who left detailed reports of his visits to the famous Parisian beauties of the day, as well as his calls on establishments of lesser repute. The king's disguise was hardly necessary, as almost everyone in Paris knew who he was and paid him his due respects, and he would be annoyed at those who didn't discover his true identity. Edward also enjoyed spending time cruising the Mediterranean along the French Riviera, although in later life he preferred the quieter Atlantic coast. The king made sure to take annual trips to Biarritz in March, when his mistress, Mrs. Alice Keppel, was staying down the road. A Scottish aristocratic lady, 27 years his junior, whom he first met as Prince of Wales in 1898, Keppel became a close confidant and remained the king's mistress for the rest of his life. Owing to his amiable personality and his generosity, as well as his interest in foreign affairs, the king relished his diplomatic role, and, in spite of his indiscretions as Prince of Wales, his contemporaries believed that his presence on the European stage helped to preserve peace on the continent during a decade of increased political tensions. European diplomats supposed that it was the king, rather than his prime minister or foreign secretary, who ran Britain's foreign policy, a belief which may have contributed to the frosty relations between the king and Balfour's foreign secretary, Lord Lansdowne. Although Edward recognised his constitutional limits, he was insistent on receiving regular briefings on foreign policy from his ministers. The king's frequent foreign visits were interpreted as a response to the proactive diplomacy conducted by Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, the son of Edward's older sister Victoria, who had briefly been Empress of Germany during the brief reign of her husband, Kaiser Friedrich III. Wilhelm also travelled across Europe in an effort to enhance the prestige of the German Empire and strengthen its navy, which, in turn, threatened to destabilise Britain's economic domination, which was guaranteed by Britain's Royal Navy. It was this desire to counter the Kaiser's European diplomacy which set the stage for another confrontation between the king and the Balfour government. In April 1903, during a visit to Italy, the king intended to pay a visit to the Pope in Rome, whom the Kaiser had already met twice. As Prince of Wales, he had also called on the Vatican on each of the 3 occasions he visited Rome. Balfour's government was not keen on the visit, concerned that it would inflame Protestant opinion in Britain, but upon receiving word from the king that he was reluctant to snub the 93-year-old pontiff, the government eventually gave the king permission to make an informal private visit. After further diplomatic negotiations with the King of Italy, whose relations with the papacy had never been particularly friendly, on the 28th of April, the king and the pope enjoyed a cordial meeting, during which the latter went out of his way not to embarrass the British sovereign. The following month, the king made a visit to France in an attempt to smooth relations between the two countries which had been under pressure in recent years following the so-called Fashoda incident in 1898, where a detachment of French troops in the Sudan had been confronted by a much larger British force under the command of General Herbert Kitchener. This sparked a war scare, which eventually forced the French to retreat. Although Balfour was reluctant to allow the trip to go ahead, the government believed that the king's long-standing popularity in France would avoid any serious mishaps. In the aftermath of the Fashoda incident and in light of French sympathies towards Britain's enemies during the Boer War, Edward boycotted France for a couple of years, but decided it was finally time to set differences aside. Unlike his regular visits to France, which took place in a personal capacity, Edward was making this visit in his full royal dignity. The visit began poorly, when the king and President Loubet received a cold reception as their carriage drove down the Champs-Élysées, but the king's cordial remarks that evening, which were reported in the press, encouraged a more positive reception from the Parisian crowd the following day, and henceforth his public appearances were met with sustained cheering. The king's visit to France, followed by President Loubet's return visit to England in July, created the conditions for the Entente Cordiale between Britain and France, signed in 1904. The Anglo-French Entente also gave Britain the opportunity to improve diplomatic relations with Russia, which had signed an alliance with France in the 1890s. As Prince of Wales, the king had made several visits to Russia, including in 1881 for the funeral of the assassinated Tsar Alexander II, and in 1894 for the funeral of his son and successor Alexander III, the husband of Alexandra's sister. However, for half a century, Anglo-Russian interests had clashed in Central Asia, and when Russia and Japan went to war in 1904 over control of the Korean peninsula, both the British government and public supported the Japanese cause and welcomed Russia's humiliating defeat in 1905. The tensions over the war prevented the king from making a visit to Russia in 1906, but in 1907 an Anglo-Russian entente had been signed which helped to settle long-standing differences by defining their mutual spheres of influence in Asia. The signing of the entente allowed the king to meet Tsar Nicholas II at Reval, modern-day Tallinn, in 1908, where he struck a warm relationship with the Russian ruler, despite raising the controversial subject of the prosecution of Jews in the Russian Empire. In 1909, Tsar Nicholas and his family were invited to England to attend the Cowes Regatta, further enhancing the goodwill between the two empires. Despite his close family connections with the Prussian royal family, which became the German imperial family after the unification of Germany in 1871, King Edward had never been a friend of Germany, especially after Prussia's expansionist wars against his wife's native Denmark in 1864 and against his beloved France in 1870 and 71. Bitterly opposed to the policies of Kaiser Wilhelm I and his Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, as Prince of Wales, he had hoped that the accession of his liberal brother-in-law, Friedrich III, would prove an opportunity to improve Anglo-German relations. However, by the time he had become Kaiser upon his father's death in March 1888, Friedrich was already dying of throat cancer, and lasted a mere 3 months on the throne before being succeeded by his more conservative son, Wilhelm II. Edward did not take any steps to disguise his disdain for his nephew, and the feeling was mutual. During the 1890s, he was irritated at the German emperor's tendency to crash the Cowes regatta, bringing with him the fastest yachts and exhibiting the newest ships of the German Imperial Navy, as if issuing a challenge to British naval supremacy. The Kaiser had been at his grandmother Queen Victoria's bedside when she died in 1901, and his genuine demonstration of grief following her death won him plaudits in England, and he spoke of a formidable Anglo-German alliance which would dominate the European continent and the high seas. Although the British and German governments entered negotiations for such an alliance, further meetings between King and Kaiser went poorly, and the British government withdrew from the talks in 1902. Relations between uncle and nephew reached rock bottom in 1905, when the Kaiser made a bombastic speech in Morocco, setting out Germany's grand imperial ambitions in the North African state. As part of the Entente, Britain had recognized Morocco as France's sphere of influence, and King Edward threw his diplomatic weight behind the French, infuriating the Kaiser, who believed the British monarch was intent on destroying the German Empire. The two men traded insults, with the Kaiser especially keen on spreading tales of his uncle's private life. Efforts to mend relations proved counterproductive when, during a visit to Britain in 1908, the Kaiser made insulting remarks about the French and Russians, claiming that Germany was Britain's only friend during the Boer War, and told the New York Times in an interview that he expected Britain and Germany to go to war, and that Germany would triumph. During a state visit to Germany in February 1909, the king was afflicted by breathing difficulties and had briefly lost consciousness as his lifelong smoking habit finally caught up with him. The king's health was not helped by a constitutional crisis that summer, with the Liberal government led by Prime Minister Herbert Asquith and his Chancellor of the Exchequer, David Lloyd George, who introduced a budget raising taxes on the wealthier part of society in order to fund a package of social welfare schemes. Although these initiatives infuriated the British aristocracy, the king hoped to persuade the House of Lords to vote through the budget passed by the Commons in accordance with a precedent that was 2 centuries old. When the Lords nevertheless voted against the budget, the Liberals approached the king with a plan to create hundreds of Liberal lords to give the government the votes to pass its legislation. The king believed this would call into question the impartiality of the Crown, even after the Liberals called a general election for January 1910 and retained their majority. The following month, Asquith withdrew the pledge to pack the House of Lords, but the impasse over the budget was only resolved following the king's death, when the Lords gave up its opposition. During his annual trip to Biarritz in March 1910, King Edward suffered from acute bronchitis and collapsed from chest pains, prompting him to stay in the French port until the end of April. He remained seriously ill upon his return to England on the 27th of April, but continued to carry out his political engagements, and despite suffering several heart attacks on the 5th of May, he vowed to continue with his work, vowing to carry on with his duties until the end. Just before midnight, on the 6th of May, King Edward VII died at his Sandringham estate at the age of 68, succeeded by his son, who took the throne as King George V. On the 20th of May, the funeral of King Edward, nicknamed the Uncle of Europe, brought together 9 European monarchs, including the German Kaiser, the kings of Belgium, Bulgaria, Denmark, Greece, Norway, Portugal, and Spain, in addition to King George V. In hindsight, the demise of Edward VII marked the end of an era, as 4 years later, the world would be engulfed in the First World War. Over the course of his 68 years, Britain retained its position as the global superpower, but the era also saw gradual changes in the underlying geopolitical dynamics which would shape the course of the 20th century. At home, Edward fought a determined but losing battle against the trend towards popular participation in the political process at the expense of the monarchy. As Prince of Wales, and later as King, Edward witnessed with apprehension the wars of German unification and the expansionist policy of his nephew Kaiser Wilhelm II. In response, he improved Britain's relations with France and Russia and helped to move public opinion behind these diplomatic partnerships. At his death, Edward was recognized as a peacemaker who helped Britain emerge from the diplomatic isolation of the Boer War, but the alliances he helped to foster also created the conditions for the terrible global conflict that was to follow. For all of Edward's fears of German expansionism, which would prove justified with the outbreak of the First World War, it was the United States, rather than Germany, which would eclipse Britain as the world's leading power in the decades following his death. What do you think of Edward VII? Was he a great statesman whose charisma helped to boost the popularity of the monarchy among the British public, and whose diplomacy likewise helped to improve public perceptions of Britain in continental Europe? Or was he indulgent and decadent with loose morals and an indolent lifestyle? Please, let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching. There is no denying that Edward led a scandalous life. He did his best to cover it all up in many respects, though. For instance, unlike monarchs who were known for their infidelity, like King Charles II, who fathered at least a dozen children and acknowledged them, making some senior aristocrats, Edward was highly secretive about whether or not he had any illegitimate children. He appears to have fathered a child with Lady Susan Vane Tempest, but almost nothing is known about what happened. All that is certain is that in September 1871, a friend of Susan's wrote to Edward referring to the crisis and how it was due in the next 2 to 3 months. Lady Vane Tempest seemingly took the secret of where the child was raised with her to the grave when she died 4 years later. Forever entangled with all the rumours, affairs and scandals created by Edward was his long-suffering wife. Alexandra of Denmark was a very different character compared with her husband. He was a playboy. She was a steady source of stability within the royal establishment. Her ascent to become Queen Consort of the United Kingdom and Empress of India in 1901 was actually surprising in a way. When she was born back in 1844, her family were not royalty. Instead, it was through a specific set of events that her father was placed in the line of succession to the Danish throne, paving the way for Alexandra to marry Edward, for better or worse, in 1863. When she became queen in 1901, her family ruled both Denmark and Greece, and her sister was the Empress of Russia. Thus, her rise was just one part of the unlikely ascent of her family to prominence all across Europe in the second half of the 19th century. This is the story of Alexandra of Denmark, the wife of King Edward VII. On the 7th of March 1863, 18-year-old Princess Alexandra of Denmark arrived in England to marry Prince Albert Edward, Queen Victoria's son and heir. As the princess made her way to London, she may have felt the weight of expectation on her shoulders. Over the next 6 decades, Alexandra would have to contend with her husband's regular infidelities, personal illness, the death of 2 of her children, and the destruction of the First World War. Despite all of this, Alexandra was a popular figure in Britain. But did she play any role in modernizing the British monarchy? This is the story of Alexandra of Denmark. The woman known to history as Alexandra of Denmark was born Princess Alexandra Caroline Maria Charlotte Louisa Julia of Denmark on the 1st of December 1844 at the Yellow Palace in Copenhagen. Her father was Prince Christian of Schleswig-Holstein, Sonderburg-Glucksburg. He was distantly related to the Danish ruling family, the House of Oldenburg. While his prospects were initially modest, in 1852 he was chosen as heir presumptive to King Frederick VII of Denmark, who did not have any children, despite marrying 3 times. Alexandra's father would consequently rule as King Christian IX of Denmark from 1863 until his death in 1906. In 1842, Christian married his cousin, Princess Louisa of Hesse-Kassel, the daughter of Princess Louisa Charlotte of Denmark and Prince William of Hesse-Kassel, a minor German prince who spent much of his life in Denmark and served as military governor of Copenhagen. Of Christian and Louisa's 6 children, 2 sons would become kings, Frederick VIII of Denmark and George I, King of the Hellenes, the name of the rulers of Greece after a monarchy was established there in the aftermath of the War of Independence against the Ottoman Empire in the 1820s. From amongst Christian and Louisa's daughters, one would become Empress of Russia, while Alexandra would become the Queen of the United Kingdom and the Empress of India. As such, while this is a somewhat forgotten royal family of one of Europe's second-tier powers in the 19th century, the members of it went on to rule as regents and consorts over large parts of the world. Despite her royal and aristocratic lineage, the princess, known to her family simply as Alex, grew up in relative austerity at the Yellow Palace. Denmark was not a wealthy kingdom with a vast colonial empire like Britain or France, and Prince Christian and his family were largely reliant on his modest income as a Danish army officer. The family's fortunes were further impacted on by the debate over the future of the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein. These duchies occupied the southern part of the Jutland Peninsula along the border with the German states. They were ruled by the King of Denmark, but remained separate political entities with their own succession laws. At the time of Alex's birth, King Christian VIII of Denmark was in his late 50s, and his son, Crown Prince Frederick, had failed to produce an heir and was believed to be infertile. While the Danish crown could pass to a female heir, this was not the case in the duchies. Southern Schleswig and Holstein were predominantly German-speaking areas that welcomed the prospect of breaking away from the Danish Union and joining a new united German state. In 1848, as a wave of revolutions swept across Europe, Christian VIII died and was succeeded by his son as King Frederick VII, who soon married the ballet dancer Louise Rasmussen as his third wife. Meanwhile, pro-German uprisings in Schleswig and Holstein encouraged a German National Assembly in Frankfurt to go to war with Denmark in March 1848. While the Danes ultimately emerged victorious after a 3-year-long conflict, their possession of the duchies remained vulnerable. An international conference held in London in 1852 named Alex's father, Prince Christian, as heir to the Danish kingdom, as well as the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein, with his mother-in-law and wife renouncing their claims to Denmark in his favour, thus resolving the problem of mixed succession practices in Denmark and Schleswig and Holstein. While Alex's family was now one step away from the Danish throne, the Glucksbergs were scandalized by King Frederick's marriage to a commoner and stayed away from court at Bernstorff Palace, a few miles outside Copenhagen, which was given to the family in 1854. As a teenager, Princess Alex enjoyed walking and riding around the grounds of Bernstorff and the nearby village of Gentofte. In England, Albert Edward, Prince of Wales, the eldest son of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert of the United Kingdom, had it proposed to him and his parents around 1860 that Alex might be a potential royal marriage partner. Known to the family as Bertie, the prince struggled to meet his parents' high expectations for a future king of England. Bertie did not share his father's intellectual interests, and while he was a sociable young man, his charming demeanour counted against him as his flirtations with actresses threatened to scandalise the British royal family. As Albert began considering Bertie's potential marriage prospects in the late 1850s, his initial preference was for his son to marry a German princess, just as his eldest daughter, Vicky, had married Prince Friedrich Wilhelm of Prussia in 1858. From Berlin, Vicky was instructed by her father to report on the suitability of a shortlist of German princesses, all of whom were rejected. This led Victoria and Albert to consider Princess Alexandra of Denmark, although they knew that this would be unpopular among their German cousins. Despite their initial misgivings, both Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, along with the British government, were conscious that establishing a royal link between Britain and Denmark through the match could potentially prevent the Germans from making a second attempt to seize Schleswig and Holstein. Vicky arranged a meeting between Bertie and Alex in September 1861 while the Prussian army was carrying out manoeuvres in the Rhineland. While Alex came away from the meeting under the impression that she had captured the prince's heart, Bertie spoke little about her when he reported back to his parents. Victoria and Albert's plans for the union of the Prince of Wales and the Princess of Denmark would face many obstacles. In November, Albert learned that shortly before meeting Alex in Germany, Bertie had engaged in a relationship with the actress Nellie Clifton while receiving military training in Ireland. Despite suffering from a lengthy illness at the time that would soon claim his life, Albert was so incensed when he learned of his son's affair that he went to Cambridge to confront him about it. When the Prince Consort died on the 14th of December 1861, Victoria held her son's recent behaviour partly responsible for her husband's demise at only 42 years of age. She was nevertheless determined to fulfil her late husband's wishes, and in September 1862, Bertie and Alex were engaged. While the announcement was welcomed in Denmark and Britain, Victoria remained sensitive to German opinion and denied a request from the Danish court for Bertie to visit Denmark before the wedding. Victoria instead invited Alex to England, where the Danish princess made a favourable impression on the widowed queen. The date of the wedding was fixed for the 10th of March 1863, though there was widespread disappointment that the ceremony was to be held at St. George's Chapel in Windsor rather than a more public celebration at St. Paul's Cathedral or Westminster Abbey in London. After leaving Copenhagen on the 26th of February, Princess Alexandra was greeted by her groom at Gravesend, and the couple were cheered on their way to London, where the Lord Mayor struggled to make his way through the thick crowds to welcome the princess. After the wedding on the 10th, the couple spent a week on honeymoon at Osborne House, the Italianate royal retreat on the Isle of Wight off the south coast of England. Osborne House had been designed by Prince Albert. The couple would spend their married life between Marlborough House, the Prince of Wales' London residence near St James's Palace, and Sandringham, the Norfolk estate purchased by the late Prince Albert as a gift to his eldest son. Early in her marriage, Alexandra witnessed a series of significant events in Europe, many of which affected her family. In autumn 1863, her 17-year-old brother Prince William was unexpectedly offered the Greek throne and became King George I of Greece. In November, King Frederick VII of Denmark died, and Alexandra's father succeeded as King Christian IX. Christian's claim on Schleswig-Holstein was challenged by Frederick, Duke of Augustenburg, a member of a rival branch of the House of Oldenburg. The Duke's claim was supported by the German states led by Prussia, whose new minister-president, Otto von Bismarck, used it as a pretext to launch the Second Schleswig War on the 1st of February 1864. The British royal family was divided between the Queen, who favoured neutrality, Vicky, the Crown Princess of Prussia, who supported the German claim, and Bertie and Alex, who vocally defended Alexandra's father's claim to the duchies. Alexandra was pregnant while the crisis was unfolding and prematurely gave birth to the first of her 6 children, Prince Albert Victor Christian Edward, nicknamed Eddie, on the 8th of January 1864. During this period, Alexandra was often at odds with Queen Victoria, who blamed her for allowing Bertie to go out to parties at night. In October 1864, not long after the Second Schleswig War ended, in Prussia and Austria securing control over the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein, Victoria reluctantly allowed Bertie and Alex to visit Copenhagen, where they were enthusiastically welcomed by the people. Although the Prince of Wales got on well with his Danish in-laws, he found life in quiet Denmark dull. On their return journey, the couple had a frosty meeting with their Prussian relations, Frederick and Vicky. Alexandra was deeply irritated by Frederick's decision to wear a military decoration he had won during the Second Schleswig War. In June 1865, Alexandra gave birth to her second son, the future King George V. Like all of Alexandra's children, the boy was born prematurely, though the pregnancy was relatively straightforward. The same could not be said for Alexandra's next pregnancy, which prevented her from attending the wedding of her younger sister Dagmar to Alexander of Russia, the future Tsar Alexander III, in November 1866. Dagmar had previously been engaged to Alexander's elder brother Nicholas, who had died of tuberculosis in April 1865. Upon her marriage, she converted to the Orthodox faith and took the name Maria Fyodorovna. Back in England, the Princess of Wales was 8 months pregnant when she developed rheumatic fever on the 15th of February. She gave birth to a daughter on the 20th, but remained in considerable pain. Her husband seemed unconcerned and continued to stay out late, causing his bedridden wife further anxiety. When rumours spread beyond the walls of Marlborough House that the princess was dying, Queen Victoria belatedly recognised the seriousness of the situation and sent word to Denmark, whence King Christian and Queen Louisa hurried to their daughter's bedside. By the 10th of May, the princess was well enough for her daughter to be christened Louise Victoria Alexandra Dagmar. Alexandra was permanently affected by the illness that had occurred following her pregnancy, which left her increasingly deaf and with a damaged leg for the rest of her life. While Bertie showed outward concern for his wife, her precarious health did not prevent him from making regular visits to France, where his encounters with Parisian ladies were the subject of much gossip. Meanwhile, Alexandra's pregnancies continued, with 2 more daughters, Victoria and Maud, born in July 1868 and November 1869, respectively. In April 1871, while the family was at Sandringham for Easter, Alexandra gave birth to a son. Despite her previous experiences of difficult pregnancies, no preparations were made, and the baby prince only lived long enough to be christened Alexander John. He died the following morning. In November 1868, the Prince and Princess of Wales left England for a 6-month trip abroad. After calling upon Emperor Napoleon III and Empress Eugenie in France, the royal couple went to Denmark for Christmas, where Bertie was quickly bored by the festivities and absconded to Stockholm with his brother-in-law, Crown Prince Frederick. The couple journeyed on to Berlin, where Alexandra tried to overcome her anti-Prussian sentiments while meeting Bismarck and King Wilhelm I. She had a better time in Vienna, where the royal couple were given a sumptuous welcome by Emperor Franz Joseph and Empress Elisabeth of what had just become the dual empire of Austria-Hungary. After leaving the territories of the Austrian Habsburgs, the royal party sailed on to Egypt in early February. The princess was invited to visit the harem of Khedive Ismail in Alexandria, where she was treated to a 20-course dinner by the Khedive's mother. As the party steamed up the Nile, Bertie enjoyed shooting at the wildlife on the riverbanks, while Alex took in the ancient sites and liberally distributed coins to boys selling trinkets they claimed to be ancient artifacts. After going past Aswan, the party turned around at Wadi Halfa near the present-day Egypt-Sudan border, where she took a liking to an orphaned Abyssinian boy named Selim and took him on as her attendant. After returning to Cairo, the Khedive took them to the almost finished Suez Canal, where they met its French developer Ferdinand de Lesseps. After leaving Egypt, the entourage went to Constantinople, where Alexandra became the first woman to dine with the Ottoman Sultan. After stopping at the battlefields of the Crimean War, Bertie and Alex visited Greece, where the latter was briefly reunited with her brother, King George. After returning to England in May, Alexandra was delighted to be reunited with her children at Osborne House, where they had been subject to Queen Victoria's draconian rules. The family headed for Sandringham, where Alexandra's new Abyssinian servant enjoyed jumping out from the bushes to frighten the local folk who had never seen an African in the flesh. Selim's jokes went too far when he was found to have tampered with the king's rifle during his birthday hunt, and he was dismissed from royal service. Meanwhile, Bertie ordered the house at Sandringham to be expanded in time for his birthday in November 1870. 1871 was to be a sad year for Alexandra, as Prussia's victory in the Franco-Prussian War led to the formation of the German Empire under the King of Prussia, now Kaiser Wilhelm I. After the loss of Alexandra's short-lived son, Alexander John, Prince Albert Edward caught typhoid in late November, and by December his condition was serious enough for Queen Victoria to travel up from Windsor. While Alexandra attended to her husband, he became delirious and alternated between abusing her and demanding her presence. After being on the brink of death in mid-December 1871, Bertie gradually rallied, though he was not fully recovered until February. The service for the prince's recovery at St. Paul's on the 27th of February 1872 was the greatest public demonstration of support for the royal family since the couple's wedding. Once again, Alexandra was the centre of attention, credited by the people for saving the future king's life through her love and grace. Despite the renewed closeness of the princely couple, Bertie would resume his extramarital affairs, and when he visited India in 1875 on a hunting and shooting tour with a group of male companions, Alexandra had to stay in England. By the mid-1870s, Alexandra was in her early 30s and the mother of 5 children who represented the new generation of British royalty. While Alexandra doted on her eldest son, Eddie, who stood second in line to the British throne after her husband, she belatedly recognised that he and his brother George were poorly educated. Rather than sending them to public school, the princes followed a long-established royal tradition and joined the Royal Navy as cadets in 1876. In September 1879, the teenage princes embarked on a 3-year cruise around the world aboard HMS Bacchante. After their return, George continued his naval career, while several tutors were employed to help Eddie prepare for university at Cambridge. In March 1881, Tsar Alexander II of Russia was assassinated by revolutionary terrorists, making Alex's brother-in-law Tsar Alexander III. Against the Queen's advice, Bertie and Alex travelled to St. Petersburg for the funeral. Security considerations forced Bertie and Alex to spend most of their time at the Anichkov Palace. After Bertie returned to England, Alex remained in St. Petersburg to support her sister, who struggled to recover from the shock of suddenly becoming Tsarina of Russia under such violent circumstances. Alexandra's family's links to the Russian Romanovs ensured that she remained well-disposed to the Russian Empire, in contrast to her hatred for all things German after the Second Schleswig War. When Kaiser Wilhelm I of the unified German Empire died on the 9th of March 1888, Alexandra refused to cancel the celebrations for her silver wedding anniversary the following day. Wilhelm was succeeded by his 56-year-old son, Friedrich III, making the Prince of Wales's sister Vicky the new empress. Alexandra was hopeful that the liberal-minded Friedrich would consider returning Schleswig-Holstein to Denmark, But the new emperor was already terminally ill with throat cancer and died in June, leaving his son Wilhelm II as the new Kaiser. When Alexandra attended Friedrich's funeral, she was appalled by the way Wilhelm insulted his mother. When the Kaiser visited Sandringham early in his reign, he got into a shouting match with the Prince of Wales and cut his visit short, prompting Alexandra to remark, "Thank God he's gone." Alexandra was otherwise a generous host at Sandringham, being equally friendly with Liberal Prime Minister William Gladstone as she was with his Conservative arch-rival Benjamin Disraeli. Despite her impeded mobility owing to her leg injury, she remained an expert horsewoman and paid special attention to the inexperienced riders among those whom her husband invited to join in his hunts. The princess loved to dance, and Sandringham held 4 balls each year, including one in December to celebrate her birthday. She particularly enjoyed the servants' ball, during which she and her husband invited their household staff and local country folk to participate in a night of dancing. While Queen Victoria rarely visited Sandringham, the monarch called on her daughter-in-law to help out with social occasions at Buckingham Palace and Windsor. Although their relationship had initially been frosty, they became closer during Victoria's later years, and in 1890 the Queen paid tribute to Alexandra by remarking, "However terrible the load which I lay upon her slender shoulders, she not only never complains, but endeavours to prove that she has enjoyed, to what to another would be a tiresome duty." The Princess of Wales' reputation for kindness and generosity encouraged the Queen to become more benevolent in her old age. Given her own incapacity, Alexandra showed particular concern for the sick and incapacitated, regularly visiting the London Hospital in the East End of London. In 1904, she would become president of the institution, now known as the Royal London Hospital, where her statue, from 1908, stands in the grounds. One of Alexandra's greatest contributions to British medicine was to persuade British doctors to introduce the Finsen lamp, which had been developed by a Danish physician and which was used to treat lupus with concentrated ultraviolet light. The princess was also concerned about the welfare of soldiers at war, and she organised the dispatch of supplies and comforts to British servicemen in Egypt and Sudan during the Mahdist War. When Queen Victoria recognised that while Alexandra could command the love and respect of the people, the same could not be said for Bertie, who was deeply in debt from his gambling habit and often departed for the continent to hunt and shoot. The prospects of the next generation seemed even dimmer, as Prince Eddie's time at Cambridge was accompanied by rumours that he was gay, which was problematic for the royal family given the social conventions of the time. In June 1885, the prince left Cambridge and enlisted in a cavalry regiment, though his shy and unassuming personality made him a poor army officer. The British Army's Commander-in-Chief, Prince George, Duke of Cambridge, proposed sending him to Gibraltar, where he would have no choice but to take his military duties seriously, but Alexandra insisted on remaining close to her favourite son. This was no longer possible when Prince Albert Victor was named among the prominent men who visited a brothel for men in the Cleveland Street scandal of October 1889. Although the prince had only made a single visit out of curiosity, it was rumoured that he was a frequent client. The wedding of Alexandra's nephew, Prince Constantine of Greece, and Bertie's niece, Sophia of Prussia, at the end of October, offered a convenient excuse for Eddie to leave England with his parents. He then journeyed to India, where he spent several months performing royal duties. Upon his return home, he was created Duke of Clarence and Avondale in an effort to improve his image. As his parents sought to find a wife for him, Eddie announced that he wished to marry Princess Hélène of Orléans, whose father was one of several claimants to the defunct French throne. While Queen Victoria gave her consent to the match, Hélène's father insisted with papal support that his daughter could not abandon her Catholic faith. After the proposed match was abandoned, Princess Victoria Mary of Teck emerged as a potential new marriage candidate for Eddie. While Alexandra was preoccupied with her son's marital prospects, her husband was increasingly absent. In 1891, the Prince of Wales was embroiled in the Tanby Croft affair that concerned allegations of cheating in a card game. While the prince himself was not the suspect, his passion for gambling was censured in the press. Meanwhile, the Prince of Wales' affair with Daisy Brooke, later Countess of Warwick, threatened to become public knowledge when Daisy's former lover, Lord Beresford, accused the prince of interfering in their relationship. When Bertie went to Germany in August 1891, Alexandra left for Denmark for more than 2 months. The princess then went on to the Crimea with Tsar Alexander III and her sister Empress Maria to celebrate their silver wedding anniversary on the 9th of November, rather than attend her husband's 50th birthday festivities at Sandringham, highlighting how their marriage was often strained. While Alexandra was away, a fire tore through Sandringham and destroyed the upper floors, prompting urgent repair works ahead of the prince's birthday. A few days later, Prince George was taken ill with typhoid fever, and Alexandra hurried back home. While her younger son was slowly recovering, Alexandra turned her attention to her elder son, who was engaged to the Princess of Teck in early December. The celebrations were short-lived, as Prince Albert Victor fell ill with pneumonia and died at Sandringham on the 14th of January 1892, a few days after his 28th birthday. While Alexandra was navigating her grief over the loss of her favourite child, her surviving son, Prince George, was now heir to the throne. George, who was created Duke of York in 1892, had hoped to marry Marie, the daughter of his uncle Prince Alfred, Duke of Edinburgh, but had been denied. He was subsequently engaged to his late brother's fiancée, Princess Mary of Teck, and married her in July 1893. Although the couple showed few signs of romantic affection towards each other, in June 1894, Mary gave birth to a son named David, the future King Edward VIII. In late October 1894, Bertie and Alex received an urgent summons from Empress Maria in Crimea, where Tsar Alexander III was dying. By the time they arrived, the emperor was already dead, leaving his ill-fated son, Tsar Nicholas II, on the throne. Nicholas had recently been engaged to Princess Alix of Hesse, the daughter of Alexandra's late sister-in-law, Princess Alice. As she had done so 13 years earlier following the assassination of Alexander II, Alexandra was on hand to comfort her widowed sister, now Dowager Empress. A week after Alexander III's funeral, the prince and princess remained in St. Petersburg for the wedding of Tsar Nicholas and his bride, who became Empress Alexandra Fyodorovna. The following year, Princess Alexandra was delighted when her daughter Maud fell in love with her cousin Prince Charles of Denmark, and the couple were married in July 1896. The British public welcomed a further link to Danish royalty, and the festivities served as a prelude for Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee in 1897. On Alexandra's suggestion, the City Corporation of London made arrangements to provide free Jubilee dinners to 300,000 poor Londoners. When Victoria was moved to tears by the display of public support during the procession on the 22nd of June, Alexandra discreetly leaned over to wipe a tear from her face. By then, Victoria was old and frail, and after more than 3 decades in waiting, Alexandra was facing the imminent prospect of becoming queen. Meanwhile, in August 1898, Alexandra travelled to Denmark to attend her 80-year-old mother, Queen Louisa of Denmark, for the last 2 months of her life. She stayed behind to comfort her grief-stricken father, King Christian, and returned to Sandringham just in time for her husband's birthday. While Alexandra would be well equipped to carry out the public-facing duties of a queen, she struggled to satisfy the physical and emotional needs of her husband. After breaking off his affair with Lady Warwick, the Prince of Wales found new comfort in the arms of the young Alice Keppel. Alexandra's natural feelings of resentment were tempered by her recognition that Alice helped improve her husband's mood. Alexandra came into her own in October 1899 after the outbreak of the Second Boer War between the British and the earlier Dutch-German settlers in the South African colonies. As president of the Red Cross Society, she ordered a yacht to be converted into a hospital ship and renamed the Princess of Wales. Alexandra was also inspired by the example of Florence Nightingale during the Crimean War and sent nurses from the London hospital to South Africa, leading to the creation of the Queen Alexandra Nursing Service in 1902. During the early days of the war, Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany visited England, where his behaviour alternated between kind words about his grandmother Queen Victoria and threats to challenge British imperial dominance. In a message to the German Foreign Secretary, Count Bernhard von Bülow, a Danish-German aristocrat whom she had known as a child, Alexandra described the German Kaiser as inwardly our enemy. After the Kaiser's departure, Alexandra returned to her war work, converting an old farmhouse on the Sandringham estate to house wounded officers. She was soon in mortal danger herself, while she and Bertie were on their way to Denmark in April 1900. As they boarded a train at Brussels, a young Italian anarchist opened fire, breaking the compartment window with one bullet and sending another that passed between the royal couple. Although Alexandra remained calm and composed, she would continue to have vivid memories of the incident and could recall every detail years later. On the 22nd of January 1901, Queen Victoria died at the age of 81 in the 64th year of her reign. Almost 4 decades after arriving in England, Alexandra was now Queen of the United Kingdom and Empress of India, while her husband became King Edward VII. After their accession, Edward made his queen a Lady of the Order of the Garter, the first time a woman had been inducted to the order since Margaret Beaufort, the mother of King Henry VII, was made a member all the way back in 1488. Alexandra made a striking impression alongside the king at the state opening of Parliament on the 14th of February, her first royal engagement as queen. Thus began the Edwardian era, a decade of glamour and jollity that preceded the tragedy that was to engulf Europe in 1914. The king and queen performed their duties effectively, although Edward was jealous of Alexandra's popularity by comparison with the public's often negative view of him. He consequently sometimes forbade her to join him on royal engagements in order to soak up the limelight himself. Shortly after Victoria's death, the Duke and Duchess of York left on a trip to Australia, leaving their 4 children with the King and Queen at Sandringham. George and Mary had reverted to Victoria and Albert's disciplinarian parenting approach, and the children were delighted to enjoy greater freedom in Edward and Alexandra's presence. After George and Mary returned from Australia at the end of the year, they were invested as Prince and Princess of Wales. Meanwhile, preparations were well underway for King Edward's coronation. 2 weeks before the scheduled date of the 28th of June 1902, Edward fell ill with appendicitis and reluctantly agreed to postpone the ceremony and undergo an operation. The surgery was successful, and on the 9th of August, Edward and Alexandra were crowned in a sumptuous ceremony at Westminster Abbey. The coronation of Edward and Alexandra in the late summer of 1902 was a notable event in the history of the era. Edward was the first new monarch in nearly 64 years, and this was an opportunity for Britain, the preeminent global superpower of the 19th century, to demonstrate its power to the world, although structurally that same imperial power was in decline. The United States had already overtaken the British economy by most metrics, and Britain was facing a growing cohort of rivals in a way which had not been the case when Victoria's coronation took place back in 1838. For the occasion, Alexandra's dress was designed by Lady Curzon, the wife of Lord Curzon, the British Viceroy of India. The new Queen admired Lady Curzon's fashion sense and had her aid her in designing a gown that had Indian elements that reflected Alexandra's dual position as both Queen of the United Kingdom and Empress of India. Roses, shamrocks and thistles designs were also incorporated into the delicate lace to symbolize the Crown's rule over England, Scotland and Ireland at a time when the Irish Home Rule and independence causes were escalating. Final alterations to the dress were made in Paris. On the coronation day, Alexandra wore this before an estimated 8,000 guests at Westminster Abbey, including prime ministers from various parts of the British dominions and dozens of Indian princes who represented the different parts of the British Raj. During the ceremony, Alexandra became the first queen consort to be crowned bearing the famous Koh-i-Noor diamond, meaning the Mountain of Light, a huge cut diamond that had come from India. The crown in question, named the Crown of Queen Alexandra, was only ever used for her coronation, though the practice of using the diamond for British royal crowns was continued, and the Koh-i-Noor diamond was reinserted into the crowns worn by Mary of Teck and the Queen Mother during their coronations in 1911 and 1937. Even after becoming king, Edward frequently travelled abroad without his wife, who would usually take the opportunity to visit relatives in Denmark or Greece. On a personal level, Alexandra's absence enabled the king to spend more time with his mistress, Alice Keppel, but Edward was also afraid that his outspoken wife would cause a diplomatic crisis. While Edward denied Alexandra access to official papers, he made them available to his daughter-in-law, Princess Mary, creating tension between the two women. Alexandra did accompany her husband to Ireland on 3 occasions, in 1903, 1904 and 1907, where her popularity helped the British government to resist demands for Irish Home Rule. In October 1903, Alexandra made a rare visit to Germany for the wedding of her nephew, Prince Andrew of Greece and Denmark to Princess Alice of Battenberg. The couple would go on to have 4 daughters and a son, Philip, who would in turn go on to marry Queen Elizabeth II. Alexandra's links to international royalty expanded in 1905 when her son-in-law, Prince Charles of Denmark, was proposed as the king of the newly independent Norway, which had been part of the Swedish crown since 1814. Alexandra was initially cautious about offering her support, but backed his claim after learning of German designs on the Norwegian throne. In November 1905, Prince Charles became King Haakon VII of Norway. A few months later, Alexandra received news that her father, King Christian IX, had died on the 29th of January 1906 at 87 years of age. Since Alexandra was particularly close to her eldest brother, now King Frederick VIII, she and Dagmar bought a private countryside retreat in Denmark called Vidå, which they frequently used as a summer residence when visiting their home country to see old friends and family. Thus, Alexandra never sundered her ties to her homeland. Alexandra's concerns about Kaiser Wilhelm echoed public anxiety about Germany's imperial ambitions in these years. The German Kaiser knew that Denmark presented a major obstacle to his hopes to challenge the British Navy in the North Sea, and came close to securing Danish neutrality from the late King Christian, only for Alexandra to urge her father to abandon the agreement. The Queen found a ready supporter in Admiral Sir John Fisher, who was appointed First Sea Lord in 1904. Like Alexandra, Fisher had warned against the British government's decision in 1890 to accept Germany's offer to exchange the Zanzibar Islands for the Heligoland archipelago off the coast of Schleswig-Holstein. Fisher believed that Germany would take action sooner or later and advocated for the strengthening of the Royal Navy in the North Sea. Fisher's solution was to invest in a new class of state-of-the-art battleships, beginning with the launch of HMS Dreadnought in 1906, which triggered an Anglo-German naval arms race. Fisher's suggestion that the Royal Navy should attack the German fleet in its home port earned him a reputation as a warmonger, as did his plans to launch an amphibious assault on Schleswig-Holstein to return it to Danish rule. While the Queen supported Fisher, the King preferred diplomacy and invited Wilhelm to Windsor on a new state visit in November 1907. While the two monarchs outwardly professed their friendship, the war drums continued to beat. By this stage, Edward's health was in severe decline, and he was regularly afflicted by attacks of bronchitis caused by his lifelong habit of heavy smoking and drinking. In summer 1908, following the Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907 that ended a long-standing dispute over Central Asia, Alexandra and Edward sailed to Reval, present-day Tallinn, to meet Nicholas II of Russia and his wife. The meeting significantly improved relations between the British and Russian courts and alarmed the Germans, who invited Edward to make a state visit to Berlin in February 1909. The king soon fell ill, and while Queen Alexandra effectively deputized for her husband, the mutual suspicions between London and Berlin remained as strong as ever. A visit in the summer by Nicholas and Alexandra to the Isle of Wight proved a happier occasion, even while a political crisis was brewing in Westminster. After several months of debate, the Liberal government's proposals for social reform in Chancellor David Lloyd George's People's Budget was rejected by the House of Lords in November. Prime Minister Herbert Asquith responded by calling an election, which the Liberals narrowly won in January 1910. Asquith threatened to create hundreds of Liberal peers to force the bill through the Lords, but the King refused. Edward's condition sharply deteriorated over the winter, and his efforts to restore his health in Biarritz were undermined by rare March snowfall. When the Queen urged him to join her on a cruise to Corfu, he refused and remained in France until late April. On the 3rd of May, Alexandra received a message that her husband was ill and hurried back to England. She arrived on the night of the 5th of May to find the King slumped in a chair. On the 6th, Edward collapsed after lunch, and the Queen personally administered oxygen to her husband in an attempt to save him, but 68-year-old Edward VII died just before midnight. After her son became King George V, Alexandra reluctantly moved out of Buckingham Palace and returned to Marlborough House. She was absent from George's coronation on the 22nd of June 1911 and was said to have lamented around this time that her deceased eldest son, Eddie, was not alive to become king. These statements aside, her absence from her son and daughter-in-law's coronation was a matter of tradition, as the Queen Dowager did not typically attend the coronation of the new King and Queen. In the years following her husband's death, Alexandra's brother Frederick VIII of Denmark died in May 1912, and in March 1913 her favourite brother, King George of Greece, was assassinated in Salonika. In June 1912, to mark the 50th anniversary of her arrival in England, Alexandra instituted Alexandra Rose Day, during which nurses handed out roses to raise funds for London hospitals. In summer 1914, the warnings Alexandra had been issuing about the Germans for half a century were finally realised. The assassination of Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo led Austria-Hungary to declare war on Serbia in late July. The Austrians received full German support, while Russia stood by its Orthodox brethren in the Balkans. German military strategists recognized that war with Russia would activate the Franco-Russian alliance of 1894 and planned to attack France in force before the Russian army could fully mobilize. While Britain did not have as strong an obligation to defend France or Russia, it was felt that the German threat to British global hegemony was very real. Thus, when the Germans marched through neutral Belgium into France on the 3rd of August, Britain declared war as a guarantor of Belgian neutrality. During the war, Alexandra reserved her bitterness for Kaiser Wilhelm and the German High Command, and she was saddened by the fact that some of her German relatives were caught up in public demonstrations of anti-German sentiment. As she had done in previous wars, Alexandra played an active role in supporting the welfare of British servicemen. She patronised the establishment of special hospitals to treat soldiers suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, and, in contrast to her daughter-in-law Queen Mary, who found visits to hospitals difficult, Alexandra showed real sympathy for the wounded soldiers. She was outraged by the execution of nurse Edith Cavell in October 1915 and saddened by the death of her friend Field Marshal Lord Kitchener, Secretary of State for War, who was killed in June 1916 on his way to Russia when the ship he was on ran into a mine. Alexandra had very direct experience of the war herself in 1915 and 1916. Aerial warfare was in its infancy when the First World War broke out in 1914. It developed intensely over the next 4 years, and by the end of it, large Gotha bomber planes and the like were being employed by the Germans. However, a lot of their bombing missions were carried out using Zeppelin airships. On 2 occasions, these attacked Sandringham while Alexandra was there, in mid-January 1915 and in early September 1916. After the first occasion, she reacted by saying, "This is too bad. Those beasts actually went straight to Sandringham. I suppose in the hopes of exterminating us with the Zeppelin bombs, though, thank God, they failed this time." Worse was to come. September 1916 saw the largest wave of Zeppelin raids of the entire war against Britain. One of these again launched attacks on Sandringham on the 17th of September, leading Alexandra and her daughter Victoria to seek shelter in the basement of the royal country house. By 1916, as large numbers of women were recruited for munitions production, Alexandra often visited the shell factories. Throughout the war, she supported her son George and strengthened his determination to defeat the Germans. In early 1917, Alexandra's nephew, Tsar Nicholas II, was removed from power in the February Revolution. The Romanovs were initially subject to house arrest by the Liberal Provisional Government, which considered the prospect of sending him to Britain. Although Prime Minister David Lloyd George agreed to offer asylum to the former Tsar, and Kaiser Wilhelm was willing to allow them to travel through Germany, King George V secretly blocked the initiative, fearing that the presence of the deposed Russian autocrat would risk socialist revolution in Britain. In August, the provisional government sent the Romanovs to the Siberian city of Tobolsk for their safety. However, after the Bolshevik Revolution in November 1917, they were taken to Ekaterinburg, where Nicholas, his wife, and their 5 children were executed in July 1918. The news of the fate of her Russian relatives dampened Alexandra's mood at a time when British, French, and American troops had successfully defeated the German spring offensive and were poised to secure victory in the war. Following the armistice, Alexandra congratulated her old friend, Field Marshal Douglas Haig, as he passed outside Marlborough House on his victory procession. Amidst the celebrations, Alexandra remained anxious about the fate of her sister Dagmar, who had taken refuge in the Crimea during the Russian revolutions of 1917. The Black Sea region was still under the control of anti-Bolshevik white armies. In April 1919, King George dispatched HMS Marlborough to convey his aunt to England. After staying briefly in England, the Russian Dowager Empress returned to her Danish homeland and spent her final years at Wiedor. In 1920, Alexandra's hopes for the return of Schleswig-Holstein were partly realized when the people of northern Schleswig voted for reunification with Denmark as part of the peace terms following the war. Alexandra had retained her youthful appearance well into her 70s, but a burst blood vessel in her eye in 1920 affected her vision for several weeks, while her deafness became increasingly acute. She continued to perform her duties, such as her annual Alexandra Rose Day rides, and remained a star attraction at a host of royal weddings, including that of her grandson Albert, Duke of York, the future George VI, and Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon in April 1923. After celebrating her 80th birthday at Sandringham in December 1924, she died after a heart attack on the 20th of November 1925, more than 60 years after her arrival in England. Alexandra's ascent during her lifetime was unexpected. First, because of the issues in the Danish succession. Her father was elevated within the line of succession and eventually became King of Denmark. This raised Alexandra's status, and she subsequently married the heir to the throne of the United Kingdom and the future Emperor of India. Her life was not easy at the same time. Her husband was a carousing philanderer who was serially unfaithful, and she lost several of her children. One difficult pregnancy left her with lifelong health complications. Alexandra spent much of her time as queen-in-waiting and then as queen travelling, often visiting her extended family back in Denmark, Greece and Russia. As a young princess, Alexandra was known as one of the most beautiful and fashionable women in Europe, and she quickly cultivated a reputation for kindness and generosity. In an age of political disorder at home and abroad, Alexandra endured a series of personal and family tragedies while sustaining the British royal family from the death of Prince Albert to the trauma of the First World War and beyond. The crown she wore on her coronation day is one of the most famous in the world, the first to be inset with the legendary Koh-i-Noor diamond. She left behind a lasting legacy as a patron of charities and hospitals, and Alexandra Rose Day continues to be celebrated every year in her memory. What do you think of Queen Alexandra? Has she been underappreciated for her role as a stabilizing presence during her 6 decades in Britain, or could she have done more to prevent her husband, King Edward VII, from leading a scandalous life? Please, let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching. Alexandra of Denmark and Edward VII's life together was colourful, to say the least. And yet, it was not as though these were two people from rich and prominent families who just seemingly couldn't avoid the media spotlight. Edward was the heir to the throne of the most powerful nation on earth throughout most of their marriage. Although he spent most of his life as the king-in-waiting, he was due to rule over a substantial part of the world and its people when he finally ascended to the throne. The expectation was that he should have acted with decorum and in a way that indicated he knew the great responsibility that he held. In reality, he did nothing of the sort and instead became the Playboy Prince and then the Playboy King. Still, for anyone familiar with royal history, there wasn't anything too unusual about this. George IV, a century earlier, and Charles II, a century again before that, had acted in much the same way. In the absence of a sombre and responsible heir to the throne, Alexandra stepped into the breach. She was the figure of respectability, although she was not without her own eccentricities, and Edward's philandering led to her spending large periods of time abroad in Denmark and visiting her siblings elsewhere in Europe. She and Edward were, in a very real sense, a royal odd couple at the very height of the British Empire.